victory. That was the word the Allies used in May of 1945. Victory over Hitler, victory over fascism, victory for freedom. But for millions of German women, that word meant nothing. Because as one nightmare ended, another began. A nightmare spoken about only in whispers. A nightmare too brutal, too shameful, too politically inconvenient for the world to acknowledge. This is the story of war crimes the victors never faced trial for, the story of 2 million women trapped in the ruins of a defeated empire, and of the silence that followed them for decades. Stay with me until the end, because only then will you understand why this atrocity, the largest in modern history, was deliberately forgotten. But to understand this, we must return to the Eastern Front. It began in East Prussia, the very edge of the Reich. After 4 years of unimaginable suffering under Nazi occupation, the Red Army now poured across the German border. For many Soviet soldiers, this was not just a military advance, it was vengeance. What followed was not victory, but devastation. Villages were stormed with a ferocity that spared no one. Soldiers kicked in doors, dragged families out into the frozen night, and tore communities apart. Women were seized wherever they were found, in barns and fields, even inside churches where they had fled, hoping for sanctuary. No one was beyond reach. Girls barely 8 years old, grandmothers in their 70s, pregnant women heavy with child, nuns who had taken vows of chastity. To the soldiers, they were all the same, spoils of war. Eyewitnesses described scenes that defy belief. In one village, soldiers formed a line outside a farmhouse, waiting their turn to violate a single woman. In another, groups of women were herded into barns and assaulted in front of their children, while husbands, powerless and unarmed, were forced to watch. Across the world, the Red Army was celebrated as the Great Liberator, the force that broke Hitler's back. But for the women of East Prussia, liberation came with a different name: torment. And yet, this was no accident of war. This was not disorder in the chaos of battle. Moscow knew, Stalin knew, and still, it continued. How could the highest powers allow this? The answer lies in revenge and silence. The Soviet High Command was not ignorant. Reports filtered in daily. Commanders issued orders demanding discipline, demanding an end to the looting, the drunkenness, the assaults. Marshal Rokossovsky signed Order Number 006, warning soldiers against violence against civilians. But these were words on paper. In the rubble of war, there was no discipline, no law. Stalin himself reportedly laughed when told of the atrocities. Can't they understand if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers has fun with a woman or takes some trifle? For the Kremlin, the suffering of German women was not a crime. It was a tool of vengeance, a symbolic punishment for the horrors Nazi soldiers had inflicted on Russia, where German troops had burned villages, slaughtered families, and committed their own atrocities. But revenge has no limits. And what soldiers did to civilians went far beyond punishment. It became a ritual of domination, and the soldiers themselves, many just boys, began to see it not as crime, but as entitlement. What happens to men when brutality becomes a right? The Diaries of Soldiers give us the answer. In the silence of their letters, the truth spilled out. Soviet soldiers wrote home with pride, as though brutality was something to boast of. Sexual violation was described as a soldier's right, a grim reward for surviving the front. Some even insisted German women offered themselves willingly, twisting violation into consent, as if conquest erased the line between choice and coercion. Others were more blunt. This was revenge, they argued. The Germans had burned villages, slaughtered families, violated women in Russia and Ukraine. Now, it was their turn. One soldier scrawled, "The Germans killed our people. Why should we pity theirs?" In these words, cruelty became justice. But beneath this veneer of revenge lay something darker, a belief that went beyond punishment. Many soldiers spoke of leaving their mark on Germany, not just in ruins, but in bloodlines. There were whispers in the ranks. Millions of Russian children would be born to German mothers. For them, sexual violation was more than an act of domination. It was conquest made flesh. And yet, even this twisted logic collapsed into savagery. The assaults became spectacles of cruelty. Women were not only violated, but mutilated with bayonets, bottles, shards of glass. Survivors described being assaulted until they could no longer stand, only to be thrown down and violated again. It was violence so extreme, even the men who committed it could not hide it from themselves. But instead of restraint, there was escalation, each act more brutal than the last. And when even children tried to resist, the cost was death. In one haunting account, a boy named Dieter Saul tried to defend his mother. He stood in front of her, begging the soldiers to stop. They shot him in the head. Then they dragged his mother away. Stories like these repeated across towns and cities. Alcohol fueled much of the violence. Soldiers drank heavily, then stormed into homes, laughing as they tore families apart. Many women, faced with the inevitable, chose suicide. In Berlin, hospital records reveal wave after wave of women arriving with injuries from self-inflicted poisonings, hangings, drownings. Some huddled together in cellars and ended their lives before soldiers could reach them. For those who survived, the nightmare often never ended. Because what came next was not just violence, it was scale. Violence so vast, it reshaped the demographic landscape of an entire country. And the numbers, they are staggering. In Berlin alone, the numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that between 95,000 and 130,000 women were violated in just that one city. The trauma was so unbearable that at least 10,000 took their own lives. Many jumped from bridges or rooftops. Others swallowed poison. For them, death felt like the only escape. And Berlin was only the beginning. In East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, the terror spread like wildfire. By the time Soviet forces had carved their path through German soil, 1.4 million women in these regions alone had been assaulted. When the war finally ended, the grim tally across Germany reached an almost incomprehensible figure: at least 2 million victims. But statistics hide what words cannot. These were not isolated assaults. Some women were violated once, others dozens of times, a few hundreds. Day after day, night after night, entire towns were turned into open-air prisons of sexual violence. This was no accident. It was not the chaos of war. It was one of the largest campaigns of sexual violence in recorded history. A crime of such vast proportions that it defies imagination. And yet, amid this devastation, some women discovered a grim truth. Their only path to survival lay not in resistance, but in submission. For many, the line between victim and survivor became unbearably blurred. If you're still watching, you understand why history like this must be told, because silence only repeats the cycle. If you want more hidden histories of betrayal, murder, and deception, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Now, let's return to the survivors and the impossible choices they faced. Faced with relentless attacks, some women made a grim calculation. If they gave themselves to one officer, he might protect them from the rest. Thus emerged the phenomenon of the occupation wife. Some Soviet officers provided food, protection, or shelter. Others treated their partners as possessions, little more than slaves. This raises a haunting question. Were these relationships consensual? Or were they survival under duress, coercion hidden under a thin veil of companionship? Some officers even deserted to stay with German women they had claimed. But for most women, it was not love. It was survival under occupation. And when the guns fell silent, a new silence took hold, one even more devastating. Because these women were not allowed to speak. In Russia, the official story was rewritten. The Red Army was to be remembered only as liberators, not as perpetrators. The mass sexual violations were omitted, erased, buried beneath a narrative of triumph. To admit otherwise would have stained the greatest symbol of Soviet pride, victory over Nazi Germany. And so, silence became state policy. In Germany, silence took a different form. For women who tried to speak, the response was often ridicule, disbelief, or condemnation. Instead of sympathy, they were accused of dishonoring their families, of bringing shame upon their communities. Some husbands turned away from their wives, unable or unwilling to accept what had been done to them. The result was a silence more crushing than the crimes themselves. Millions of women carried the weight of their trauma alone, many to the grave, never once uttering their story aloud. Their suffering was hidden behind closed doors, behind forced smiles, behind decades of unspoken pain. This silence was not accidental, it was deliberate. It ensured that one of the largest war crimes of the 20th century remained unpunished, unacknowledged, and almost forgotten. Almost, but not entirely, because history leaves traces. The forgotten war crimes against German women remain a scar that history tried to cover. No trials, no justice, only silence. And yet, silence itself is a testimony. These women's voices may have been stifled, but their suffering echoes in every ruined street, every statistic, every unmarked grave. To remember them is not to excuse Nazi crimes, it is to face the truth that even victors commit atrocities, and that war always finds its cruelest expression in the bodies of women. If this story spoke to you, don't let it vanish again. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell. And when you're ready, click the next video on your screen, because there are more secrets history tried to bury, and together, we will bring them back into the light.